You're really going to marry him?
Yes. Yes. Look at me, Chloe. Olivia. No. Don't say my name. He was my husband. And you were my sister.
I found the wedding invitation in my own mailbox. My name was on it. So was my ex-husband's. The bride was my sister. I stood in my driveway for almost 10 minutes before I could make myself open the envelope, because some part of me already knew what I would find inside, and I still wasn't ready for it to be real. My hands were shaking so badly I tore the corner of the card before I even got it open. Inside was a date, a location, a dress code, and 2 names printed in gold script that I never once expected to see sitting next to each other on the same piece of paper in my entire life. She didn't just take my husband. She wants me standing next to her when she marries him, not sitting quietly in the back row where I could disappear into the crowd for a few hours and go home. Standing beside her, in front of everyone who has ever known our family, wearing whatever color she picks out for me, holding her flowers while she says vows to the man I used to call mine. I read that invitation 4 times before I let myself understand what she was actually asking me to do. And by the 4th time, my hands had gone completely still. I wasn't scared anymore. I was something else, and it took me weeks to find the right word for it. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What you need to understand is that this didn't come out of nowhere, and it didn't happen the way anyone in my family likes to tell it now. There was a version of my life, not that long ago, where my sister and I still spoke every single day, where my husband still came home to me every night, and where the 3 of us sat around the same table at every holiday, without anyone in that room carrying a secret. I want you to hold on to that picture, because almost none of it survives what I'm about to tell you, and by the time I'm done, you'll understand exactly how much was already broken long before I ever saw it. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why I said yes to that invitation, and what I actually did the moment someone finally handed me a microphone at her wedding. This isn't only a story about a woman who lost her husband to her own sister. It's a story about a promise our mother asked the 2 of us to make before she couldn't ask us for anything again, and about how far one daughter was willing to go to make that promise look real, even when it wasn't. Stay with me until the end, because nothing about how this actually turns out is what you think is coming right now. There are 3 people at the center of this. There's me, Olivia. There's Nathan, the man I married when I was 26 and thought I understood what forever meant. And there's Chloe, my younger sister, the one person I would have said, right up until the day I found out otherwise, knew me better than anyone else alive. I want you to hold on to those 3 names, because everything that happens from here on out happens between the 3 of us, and nobody else in this story gets to decide how it ends. Here's what I still don't fully know how to answer, even now. Why would a woman ask the sister she betrayed to stand beside her at her own wedding? Was it cruelty, plain and simple, or was Chloe hiding something bigger than either of us understood at the time? And maybe the question people ask me the most, the one I still turn over some nights: why did I actually say yes? The answer isn't about forgiveness. It's about what our mother asked for, before she couldn't ask for anything anymore. Everything I'm about to tell you, every betrayal, every lie, every moment that broke something in our family that never fully went back together, all of it eventually leads back to one woman's last wish, and what her daughters were willing to do to make it look granted. I met Nathan at a backyard barbecue thrown by a mutual friend. The kind of ordinary summer afternoon nobody remembers as important until years later, when it turns out to be the beginning of everything. He was quiet in a room, the type of man who let other people finish their stories before he ever started his own, and I liked that about him immediately. We dated for 2 years before he proposed, on a Tuesday, of all days, no big production, just the 2 of us in our kitchen after work. because he said he didn't want to wait for a weekend to ask me something he already knew the answer to. We married at 26. We built our life the ordinary way, out of small chosen mornings rather than any one grand moment, and for a long time, ordinary felt like the safest word in the world. We bought our first house in our 3rd year of marriage, a small 2-bedroom with a kitchen too tight for 2 people to cook in at the same time, and I remember Nathan standing in the empty living room the day we got the keys, turning in a slow circle like he couldn't quite believe a bank had trusted us with something this large. We spent that whole first weekend painting the guest room a color we argued about for 2 hours in the hardware store, and both secretly loved once it dried. Small rooms like that are where a marriage actually gets built, I think, far more than in any of the bigger moments people photograph. Nobody photographs the paint arguments. I wish someone had. Our father, Robert, died when I was 17, and Chloe was 15. And I think that's the piece of this story most people never think to ask about. After he was gone, our mother, Margaret, became the only parent either of us had left to prove ourselves to, and I watched, without fully understanding it at the time, how that changed the shape of our whole family. Chloe was 2 years younger than me, and from the time we were kids, she was the one people noticed first. Quicker with a joke, easier in a room full of strangers. I remember a school talent show when I was 11, where I'd practiced a piano piece for 6 straight weeks, only to watch Chloe get pulled up on stage last minute for a solo she'd barely rehearsed, because our music teacher said she simply had a spark that couldn't wait its turn. I told myself it didn't mean anything. That's how these patterns work. They never show up large enough to point at, until one day you look back and realize they were the whole shape of your childhood. Everything shifted when Margaret got sick. I remember the exact afternoon we found out. The 3 of us crowded into a doctor's office meant for 2, Chloe gripping my hand so hard in the waiting room beforehand that my fingers went numb. Both of us bracing for whatever the other side of that door was about to tell us. For a few hours that day, none of what came later existed yet. We were just 2 sisters, holding on to each other the way we had our whole lives before anyone in that family had a reason to lie. I won't walk you through every detail of her diagnosis, because that was never mine to hand out for anyone's entertainment. But I will tell you it was serious, and it was the kind of serious that rearranges a family overnight. I think about that waiting room a lot now, more than almost anything else from that whole year. It's strange, the moments your mind decides to keep. Not the wedding invitation, not the tablet, that waiting room, and how close Chloe and I still were in it, right before we weren't anymore. Margaret wanted her girls close. She said it constantly, in that quiet, pleading way people say things when they're starting to understand time isn't unlimited anymore. So Nathan and Chloe started showing up at her house more, running errands, sitting with her through appointments, spending entire weekends rebuilding the back porch railing she'd been asking someone to fix for 2 years, taking the load off me while I worked, and tried to hold everything else together. I want to be honest with you. Nothing about that felt wrong while it was happening. It felt like relief. It felt like 2 people I loved taking care of a 3rd person I loved. And I was grateful, genuinely grateful, for the help. It was only later, once I had every reason to look back and pick the whole thing apart, that I noticed how often Nathan's phone lit up with Chloe's name after those visits, how late those porch weekends sometimes ran into the evening, how easily the 2 of them fell into private jokes I wasn't part of anymore. None of it was loud. None of it screamed at me to pay attention. I want you to remember that too, because it matters for what comes next. I want to tell you something about Nathan that took me years and a lot of therapy to actually understand. He was never a cruel man, not in any obvious way, but he was a man who measured his own worth almost entirely by how needed he felt in a given moment. Early in our marriage, that showed up as devotion. Always the first to help a friend move. Always the one Margaret called first for anything around the house. Later, I came to understand it differently. He wasn't drawn to Chloe because she was more exciting than me. He was drawn to how visibly she needed him, at exactly the moment in her life when she needed someone the most. I don't say that to excuse him. I say it because it matters for how this story actually ends. And it will. Margaret was the kind of mother who believed conflict inside a family should stay inside the family. Quietly, permanently, no matter what it cost the people carrying it. She raised us both to be polite before we were honest, to smooth things over before we ever let them get loud. And I think that single lesson, more than anything else, is the reason none of us knew how to handle what eventually happened between the three of us. She never meant harm by it. She simply grew up believing that a family that looked whole from the outside was worth almost any private cost to maintain, and she passed that belief down to both her daughters without ever once explaining where it came from. I should tell you, too, that Chloe and I were close once. Genuinely close. Not just sisters by obligation. She'd had her own engagement fall apart in her late 20s. A man named Marcus who left 3 months before their wedding date, and I was the one who sat on her bathroom floor with her the night she found out. The one who canceled the venue on her behalf, because she couldn't bring herself to make the call. She worked in event planning, of all things, building other people's perfect days for a living, while quietly convinced she'd never get one of her own. I think that mattered more than any of us realized at the time. When Nathan started paying her the kind of attention that made her feel chosen again, I don't believe she set out looking for it. I believe she simply didn't know how to say no to being wanted, after years of feeling like the daughter who almost had everything and lost it. There's one more memory from before all of this that I keep coming back to. The summer I turned 15, our whole family drove 11 hours to the coast for what turned out to be the last real vacation we ever took together before our father passed. Chloe and I shared a pull-out couch in a rented cottage that smelled like salt and sunscreen, staying up too late every night trading secrets we swore we'd never tell anyone else alive. I think about that cottage more than I think about almost anything from our adult lives, because it's the last version of us I have where neither of us had anything to forgive the other one for yet. I remember our 8th anniversary that fall, with a clarity I can't fully explain, given how unremarkable it actually was. Nathan cooked dinner, badly, the way he always did, and we ate it anyway on the couch, and fell asleep halfway through a movie neither of us finished. It was nothing. It was everything. I didn't know it yet, but I was going to spend a long time trying to get back to a night exactly like that one, and never quite managing it. A friend from work, Priya, was the first person to say anything out loud, weeks before I let myself see it. She asked, gently, over coffee in the break room, if everything was okay at home. Said Nathan had seemed distracted the one time she'd run into us together at the pharmacy. I told her we were fine. I believed it when I said it. Around that same time, I called Chloe directly, on the phone, and asked her, almost as a joke, if there was anything going on I should know about. She laughed it off so easily, so convincingly, that I felt foolish for even asking. I want you to sit with that, because she lied to my face on the phone before I ever found a single message. The small things kept arriving one at a time, over the better part of 2 months, the way small things do, each one easy enough to explain away on its own. Nathan's phone, always face down on the counter now, when it never used to matter before. A late shift that didn't line up with the job site he told me he'd been at. A perfume on the collar of his jacket that wasn't mine. Faint enough that I told myself twice I was imagining it before I let myself actually believe my own nose. A weekend work trip he came back from oddly quiet, distracted through an entire dinner I'd spent an hour cooking, answering my questions about his day half a beat too slow, like he was translating the real answer into something safer before he let it out. Our neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Alvarez who'd lived next door since before we bought the house, mentioned once, in passing, that she'd seen his truck parked outside Margaret's place well past midnight, on a night he'd told me he was staying late at the office. I thanked her for telling me. I didn't do anything with it for almost another week. The night everything came apart, I wasn't even looking for it. Margaret kept a shared tablet at her house, the one we all used to coordinate her medical appointments, her medication schedule, the calendar, the whole family relied on to make sure she was never left without someone showing up. I picked it up to check her next appointment, and a message thread was still open. Nathan and Chloe. Months of it. Going back further than that anniversary I'd just told you about. Further than I could stand to count while I was standing in my mother's kitchen with the tablet shaking in my hands. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I still do. The exact tool my family built to take care of our mother was the same place I found out my husband and my sister had been lying to all of us since sometime that summer. I confronted them both that same night, in Margaret's living room of all places, with a get well card still sitting propped on the side table like the whole house hadn't just quietly rearranged itself around a secret. Nathan's defense came out fast, almost rehearsed, like he'd practiced it in his head for weeks waiting for this exact moment. "It just happened," he said. "We never meant to hurt anyone." I asked him how long, and he wouldn't give me a straight number, which told me everything the tablet hadn't already. Chloe didn't say much of anything at all. She sat there, and she let him talk, and I remember thinking that her silence told me more than any explanation either of them could have offered. At one point I asked her, directly, whether our mother knew, and she shook her head so fast, I almost believed she was more afraid of that than of losing me. I left that house and drove, with no real destination, until I ended up parked outside a hotel 2 towns over, calling Denise at nearly midnight, because I couldn't make myself walk inside alone. She stayed on the phone with me for almost an hour, mostly just listening, until I finally had the strength to check myself in. I didn't sleep that night. I remember sitting on the edge of that hotel bed until the sun came up, running the last several months backward in my head, trying to find the exact moment I should have noticed, and hating myself a little for not finding one. That was the last night I slept in that house. I didn't know it yet, but it was also the last time I'd see my sister for 2 years. Telling people came in its own painful stages. My boss first, because I needed a few days off and owed her some kind of explanation. Then a small group of friends, over a dinner Denise organized without really asking me if I wanted it, where I found myself repeating the same handful of sentences so many times that they stopped sounding like my own life and started sounding like a story I was reciting about somebody else. I didn't tell extended family for almost 3 weeks. I wasn't protecting Chloe. I think I was protecting myself, for just a little longer, from having to watch people's faces change once they knew. In the weeks that followed, I found myself doing something I never expected to become good at, piecing together a timeline I didn't want but couldn't stop building anyway. Old texts I'd never thought twice about. A joint credit card charge from a weekend I remembered Nathan telling me he was out of town for work. A hotel receipt Denise found, tucked where it was never supposed to be found at all. Every new detail moved the start date back further than I wanted it to go. I remember the night Denise found that receipt specifically, because we were only looking through an old box of mine at the time. Nothing to do with any of this, just sorting through what to keep and what to throw out from the house. It had slipped between 2 folders of old tax paperwork, months out of date, a charge for a room 40 minutes outside of town, on a weekend I remembered clearly, because I'd asked Nathan to pick up dinner on his way home from a supposed job site, and he'd shown up 2 hours later than expected, apologizing about traffic that, as far as I could ever confirm, never actually existed. Denise didn't say anything for a long moment. She just handed it to me and let me sit with it, which I've always been grateful for, because I don't think I could have handled her saying the obvious thing out loud in that exact moment. What broke me wasn't the affair itself. Not exactly. It was my mother. Margaret refused to pick a side. She'd tell me she loved me, and in the same breath, she'd remind me that Chloe was still her daughter too, as if loyalty was something that could be split evenly down a courtroom line. Denise said it to me straight, sitting across from me at my kitchen table one night, when I couldn't stop crying. Her own mother wouldn't say it was wrong. I didn't have anything to say back to that, because she was right, and hearing it out loud from someone who loved me was somehow worse than figuring it out on my own. Our extended family split without anyone officially asking them to. An aunt who'd always favored Chloe kept inviting her to holidays and quietly stopped inviting me. I called her once that winter, more out of hurt than strategy, and asked her directly why she'd made her choice so easily. She told me, in a tone that still sits with me, that Chloe had always struggled more, that she needed the family's patience more than I did, as if my own struggle that year had somehow disqualified itself from counting, simply because I was the one who'd been wronged. I didn't call her again after that. A family group chat, the same one we'd used for years to share photos and birthday reminders, turned into a place I had to mute just to get through a Tuesday. The day I actually moved my things out of the house was its own kind of quiet devastation. Boxes labeled in Denise's handwriting because mine kept shaking too badly to read afterward. Biscuit pacing between rooms like he understood something was wrong, even if he couldn't understand what. I left more behind than I took, on purpose. I didn't want reasons to come back. Around town, a version of the story started circulating that I never once told anyone myself, one where I was somehow the reason Nathan had strayed in the first place. Too distant, too focused on work, whatever explanation people needed to make the story easier to hold. I went to see a therapist for the first time in my life that winter. Not because I thought it would fix anything, but because I needed one room in my week where nobody was choosing a side. For a while, I believed something else entirely, something almost easier to hold on to than plain betrayal. I found out Chloe had gone to Margaret months before any of this became public, asking for help with a down payment on a house. I convinced myself, for longer than I'm proud of, that this whole thing had been about money from the start, that my sister had calculated her way into my life and my marriage for a piece of whatever our mother had left to give. I needed a reason that made sense. I needed Chloe to be someone I could hate cleanly, without complication. It would take me a long time to learn that wasn't the whole truth either. Somewhere in that first ugly month, a rumor reached me through a mutual friend that made my stomach drop in a completely different way. Someone claimed Nathan had done something similar years before, with a coworker, back when we'd only been married 2 years, long before Chloe was ever part of the picture. I spent almost 2 weeks chasing that thread, calling people I hadn't spoken to in years, needing it to be true almost as badly as I needed it to be false, because if it were true, it would mean I'd simply married a man who did this, and none of it would have anything to do with what was broken in my own family. In the end, it turned out to be nothing. A misremembered office party. A friendship that had never been more than that. I was almost disappointed. A clean villain would have been so much easier to live with than the truth I actually had to sit with instead. The divorce moved the way divorces move. Slowly, then all at once. Mediation rooms and lawyers, and a marriage that used to fit in a kitchen too small for 2 people, now reduced to paperwork on a table between us. There was one hearing, the closest thing to a real courtroom this whole process ever produced, where a judge who looked tired of hearing other people's marriages fall apart asked us both, almost as a formality, whether either party had anything further to add before finalizing the terms. Nathan said no immediately. I sat there for a long moment before I said no too. Not because I didn't have anything left to say, but because I finally understood that a courtroom was never going to be the place where any of it actually got said. In one of those mediation sessions, Nathan's attorney tried to argue that the house should go to him, since he'd be the one continuing to help with Margaret's care. And I remember sitting there thinking that even in a room designed to divide us fairly, he was still finding ways to use my mother's illness in his favor. We argued over almost nothing else that actually mattered in the end, except for one thing that somehow hurt more than the house or the furniture ever did. Biscuit, our dog, the one we'd adopted together our 2nd year of marriage, and watching 2 lawyers negotiate custody of an animal who had no idea what either of us had done to deserve losing half of him, broke something in me I didn't know was still breakable. I got him in the end. I don't know if Nathan ever forgave me for fighting that hard over a dog, and I've stopped caring whether he did. I remember one mediation session in particular, sitting across a conference table from Nathan, while our lawyers spoke about our marriage in the flattest possible language. Division of assets, equitable distribution, terms that made 8 years sound like a spreadsheet. He wouldn't quite look at me the whole meeting, And at one point, when the topic of Margaret's care schedule came up, since he'd still been listed as an emergency contact at her doctor's office, I watched him realize, almost in real time, that untangling himself from my family wasn't going to be as simple as untangling himself from me. Some part of me took a petty, private satisfaction in that. I'm not proud of it. I'm also not going to pretend it wasn't real. Work became the one place I could go where nobody expected me to explain anything. Priya covered for me more than once that first month. On days I'd show up and simply not be able to hold a normal conversation together. My boss never asked questions directly, just quietly moved a few deadlines without making it a whole conversation. And I've never forgotten that kind of ordinary decency showing up exactly when I needed it most. My therapist, a woman I saw every other week for the better part of a year, was the first person who ever said out loud that I was allowed to be angry at my mother too, not just at Nathan and Chloe, and something about hearing that from someone with no stake in any of it let me finally feel it without guilt. Nathan and Chloe's relationship went public not long after, and our small town did what small towns do, which is talk. A version of the story circulated for a while, that I'd somehow driven Nathan away myself. Too distant, too focused on work, whatever explanation people needed to make the story easier to hold. And I learned that year exactly how much energy it takes to stop caring what strangers at the grocery store believe about your own marriage. I moved into a new apartment on my own that spring, smaller than the house, quieter than I expected to be able to stand, and I rebuilt from there, one ordinary day at a time, the same way Nathan and I had once built our marriage. 6 months in, I heard through a cousin that Chloe and Nathan had moved in together. Around that same time, Denise finally convinced me to try dating again, and I let a coworker's friend take me to dinner exactly once. He was kind and easy to talk to, and I spent most of the meal only half present, doing the math in my head on how long it had actually been since I'd trusted anyone with an ordinary Tuesday night. I never called him back. It wasn't him, I just wasn't finished yet, and pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of lie. 8 months in, I heard they were engaged, secondhand, through the same family group chat I'd long since muted. By the 10-month mark, I'd started sleeping through full nights again without waking up somewhere around 3 in the morning, which felt like a strange thing to count as progress, and yet it was the only kind of progress I had. And then, at 14 months, without warning, in the middle of an aisle at the grocery store I'd been shopping at for a decade, I turned a corner, and there they were, together, picking out produce like any other couple on any other Tuesday. I don't remember what I said. I remember exactly how it felt, and I remember driving straight to Denise's apartment afterward instead of my own, because I wasn't ready to be alone with it yet. 2 years passed that way, quietly, painfully, slowly turning into something I could almost call a life again, and then one afternoon I opened my mailbox and found the invitation I told you about at the very beginning of this. Which brings us right back to where we started. Here's what I didn't know when I opened that envelope. Margaret's condition had taken a hard turn that spring. A bad scan, a hospital stay none of us were fully prepared for, and somewhere in the middle of that stay, in the middle of the night, in the particular kind of quiet that only exists in hospital rooms after visiting hours end, she'd pulled Chloe aside and told her the one thing she wanted more than anything else before the end. Chloe told me later that our mother hadn't even framed it as a request. She'd simply said it like a fact she needed someone else to carry once she couldn't carry it herself. She wanted to see her daughters in the same room again, not fighting, not performing peace for a camera or a room full of relatives, just actually, finally, at peace. She never once mentioned a wedding. That detail, Chloe told me, was entirely her own idea. The only version of togetherness she could think to build fast enough to make it in time. Chloe took that wish and twisted it into something I don't think she fully understood herself until much later. Asking me to stand beside her at her wedding wasn't cruelty, not the way I'd assumed for 2 straight years. It was guilt, dressed up as an act of love, an attempt to erase what she'd done by staging the one image our mother had asked for, whether or not it was actually true. I called Denise before I made any decision, and she said what any good friend would say, that I didn't owe anyone this, least of all the sister who'd lied to my face on the phone before any of it was even confirmed. She wasn't wrong. But I drove to see Margaret alone first, before I gave Chloe an answer. And my mother, who still had no real idea what she'd actually set into motion, took my hand and told me she just wanted her girls to be okay, whatever that ended up looking like. She wasn't asking me for a performance. She genuinely believed she was asking for something real, and that was the part I couldn't walk away from. I went to see Chloe next. I hadn't planned to forgive her, and I didn't. But something in her broke open that afternoon that I wasn't expecting. She told me she'd started that engagement planning process 3 separate times and stopped, unable to send the invitation with my name on it, unable to leave it off either, because both felt like admitting something she wasn't ready to say out loud. She wasn't asking me to forgive Nathan. She was terrified, genuinely terrified, that our mother was going to die believing her 2 daughters never found their way back to each other. I asked her, point blank, whether she actually loved him, or whether this had all become something neither of us knew how to walk back from anymore. She didn't have a clean answer for me, and honestly, I respected that more than if she had. Sitting across from her, I finally understood exactly what I was being asked to do. Not to forgive, to perform. To give our dying mother one afternoon that looked like healing, whether or not any healing had actually happened underneath it. I said yes. But not for the reason anyone in that room believed. The weeks between saying yes and the wedding itself were their own strange kind of purgatory. I went to exactly one dress fitting, standing on a small platform in a boutique, while a stranger pinned fabric around me and Chloe watched from a chair a few feet away, neither of us saying much of anything, the whole appointment conducted in the careful, overly polite tone of 2 people who used to never need to be careful with each other at all. I caught my own reflection at one point and didn't recognize the woman in it, not because the dress didn't fit, but because I couldn't tell anymore which version of myself was actually standing there. The wedding day came, and getting ready that morning felt like preparing for a performance I'd rehearsed in my head 100 different ways, and still didn't feel ready for. Relatives I hadn't seen since the divorce kept catching my eye across the room, unsure whether to smile at me or look away, and I watched more than one of them decide on a careful, tight-lipped nod instead. I saw Nathan for the first time in 2 years right before the ceremony, and neither of us said much of anything, just a nod, the kind 2 people give each other when there's nothing left worth saying out loud. I stood beside my sister exactly the way I'd promised. There was one moment before the ceremony that I didn't think much of at the time, and only understood much later. Nathan kept finding reasons to linger near the coordinator, a woman about our age who'd been hired through Chloe's own event planning contacts, laughing a little too easily at something that hadn't seemed that funny to anyone else standing there. I filed it away the same reflexive way I used to file away a phone left face down on a counter, and then I let it go, because it wasn't my marriage to protect anymore. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened next. I didn't go there to humiliate anyone, and I didn't go there for revenge either, even though I'd imagined a dozen versions of that speech in the months leading up to it. Versions where I said everything out loud in front of everyone who'd ever doubted me. When they finally handed me the microphone for the maid of honor toast, the room went quiet in that particular way rooms do, right before something unexpected happens, and I could feel everyone waiting to see which version of me was about to speak. I didn't talk about Chloe. I didn't talk about Nathan. I turned toward my mother, sitting in the front row in a wheelchair she still refused to admit she needed, and I thanked her. For everything. For every version of us she'd ever tried to hold together. And I ended with one line that landed differently for every single person in that room, though only I really understood what I meant by it. I'm not here for the bride. I'm here for the woman who raised us both. I handed the microphone back before the first dance even started, and I walked out. Not as revenge. As something closer to self-respect. I'd given my mother the moment she needed to see. I hadn't given my sister or my ex-husband the closure they were hoping for, and I never intended to. Margaret passed away several months later, having witnessed what she believed, right up until the end, was real peace between her two daughters. I'll tell you honestly, since you've stayed with me this far, Chloe and I never actually reconciled after that day. We sent the occasional text on birthdays, polite, distant, nothing like what we used to have. What our mother saw was real to her, and I'll always be glad she got to see it. But some family isn't lost to death. It's lost to the version of it we perform for the people we still don't want to disappoint. I need to tell you the rest of it, because I promised you at the beginning that nothing about how this ends would be what you expected, and I meant that. 10 months after that wedding, Chloe called me for the first time since Margaret's funeral. She wasn't calling to reconcile. She was calling because she'd found messages on Nathan's phone, the same coordinator I'd noticed lingering near him before the ceremony, going back to almost the week of the wedding itself. She asked me, through tears, how I'd known to look, how I'd caught it the first time, like there was some skill to it she could still learn secondhand from the sister she'd already taken everything from. I didn't gloat. I didn't feel the satisfaction I always assumed I'd feel if this exact moment ever came. Mostly I just felt tired for her, in a way that surprised me. Denise was waiting for me in the parking lot when I walked out of that reception, no questions, just the passenger door already open. Priya sent me a text the next morning that just said she was proud of me, and I still have it saved. My therapist and I spent most of our next session just sitting with the fact that I'd finally done something for my mother that had nothing to do with what anyone else wanted from me, and how strange it felt for those two things to finally line up. A year on from that wedding, I can tell you I'm not the same woman who opened that invitation in her driveway, hands shaking, unable to breathe. I have my own apartment, my own quiet mornings, biscuit curled up at the foot of my bed most nights, and a version of peace that belongs entirely to me, instead of to anyone else's wish. Chloe and Nathan separated not long after that phone call. I didn't ask for details, and I didn't need to. I already knew exactly how that story went, because I'd lived the first draft of it myself. Some patterns don't stop just because a wedding happens. They just wait for a new name to attach themselves to. I still think about my mother's exact words in that hospital room sometimes, the ones Chloe finally repeated back to me, and I've made my peace with the fact that I'll never fully know whether the version of those words that reached me was the truth, or simply the version my sister needed it to be. Either way, I gave my mother what she asked for, and I got to walk away afterward as exactly who I actually am, not who anyone else needed me to become. So I'll leave you with the same two questions I still ask myself. Was that peace, or just a very good performance? And knowing everything you know now, would you still have shown up to that wedding at all? What do you think I was really thinking in the moment I handed that microphone back? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. If stories like this hit close to home, subscribe. There's a new one every week.